right, we're back for another episode of the Frozen Assets podcast series where we're focused on featuring entrepreneurs and companies in the freeze drying space where we can learn more and more about this growing industry. We're here today with Gene Ligman, who is the owner of SunTorr, and he's going to talk to us about his background and credibility in the freeze drying space so that we can understand more about freeze drying, the process, freeze drying as a business, and how we can grow and be more innovative as entrepreneurs as we kind of dabble all in terms of candy, ice cream, food, pet food, everything. So we're going to cover a lot of different topics today, and you're going to really enjoy this conversation. So without further ado, Gene, why don't you introduce yourself? Tell us, why you like to talk about freeze drying in your background.
Yeah, I started SunTorr about 3 years ago. I have an engineering degree, so I've been a mechanical engineer for quite a long time. And I also really specialized in vacuum applications. So vacuum applications are actually a lot trickier than a lot of people think because things vaporize that you don't expect to vaporize when you're under vacuum. And so one of the applications that I spent a lot of time dealing with, particularly in my last years working for Leibold, who is a major vacuum equipment supplier, is freeze drying. So out in the field, I would be speaking with factories or customers who were doing commercial size freeze drying projects. We're talking about thousands to tens of thousands of pounds per day of freeze dried material. And one of the things that they kept asking me was, do you know anyone who makes a good freeze dryer? And the second thing was, do you know how this thing works? When I left Leibold a few years ago to start my own business, I really wanted to focus on freeze drying. Because I ended up doing a kind of a deep dive in freeze drying, and it really appealed to my physics geeky side. The deeper I dug, the more I was fascinated. So, because there's a lot of things going on in freeze drying. It is a process where you're removing moisture from your product and you're depositing it on your vapor condensers. That is essentially all that's going on in a freeze dryer from a really high level point of view. But there are so many things you got to do, and you got to do right in order to get it to operate properly, in order to get good quality product. So yeah, the more I dug into it, the more I really liked it.
And what's your company do, SunTorr?
So I started SunTorr with the mission to help provide information about freeze drying to the world and other vacuum applications, but mostly freeze drying. You see, when you go out and you look for information about freeze drying out in the big wide world, maybe on the web or talking to people, there's not a lot of really good information out there. I mean, there's the OEMs who build the freeze dryers. They know some things, but many of the OEMs know shockingly not as much as they ought to, considering that they're building professional machines that do this. The scientific community hasn't really focused on commercial freeze drying. There's a lot of information on medical freeze drying or really, highly technical laboratory type freeze drying, but freeze drying that's actually used for the commercial industry for food products and other similar products, there's just not a lot of information. So there's a lot of really what I'll call 30,000 foot level information. Yeah, there's these 3 or 4 or 5 steps that you do, to freeze dry product, but none of it really tells you what's going on inside. And it turns out that when you know what's going on inside your freeze dryer, you're suddenly a lot more able to tweak your product recipes, right? Because every product has a little different profile of process steps that you need to use in order to get the highest quality product in the shortest period of time. When you know what's going on inside your freeze dryer and how things are affected by things like pressure and how much heat you're putting in and how much refrigeration you have, you can start making modifications to your process recipes. You can make modifications to your machine. You can even change your schedule. You can change how you distribute your product in your chamber. And all of these things can really add up to be, in a commercial setting, worth a lot of money. I mean, we're not talking about thousands of dollars. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars or even millions, depending on how big your operation is.
Let's talk about that. Like, so with your background in freeze drying, you know, a lot of us, prior to one of the largest brands that's out there today that we all know of, for the home freeze dryer side, prior to that, we only really knew about Mountain House, you know, backpacking type of meals and things like that. And, you know, the military using them for preserving type of meals and things like that. Like, what was Mountain House using prior to, you know, the brands that we know today, very, very much on the home freezer side? What were they using before? Are they changing and adapting to what they're doing now because of all this new innovation technology?
Yeah, so Mountain House is a brand that was made by a company called Oregon Freeze Dry. They're in Salem, Oregon. So I went to see their factory quite a number of years ago, and they built all their own freeze dryers from scratch, which is kind of how you had to do it way back in the day. There's actually a number of companies out there who have been doing commercial freeze drying for some time who started by building their own chambers. It wasn't really until maybe 10 years ago or so that, in America anyway, that you started being able to get commercial freeze dryers that were built to a standard that would allow you to do commercial production in. So that's really what you had to do. Yeah, so Mountain House was just one of those companies. Another one you might have heard of or might not have heard of is Van Drunen Farms. So they're a huge fruit, mostly fruit farmer that went into freeze drying maybe 20, 25 years ago. I think overall they have the largest, at least of that I know of, the largest freeze drying operation for human consumption that I can think of. Another company is Thrive. They have called themselves Thrive Life or Thrive. Both, they're all the same company. They're in Salt Lake City, Utah. So they also have just a huge number of facilities all over the country and all over the world. Again, they started out building their own machines. Eventually, they moved to a European freeze dryer that makes really gigantic freeze dryers. That's what I've seen in the field anyway, that a lot of companies start either by building their own or the older companies. Nowadays, it turns out that it's a lot more cost effective to have a qualified OEM who really knows what they're doing build your machinery for you. There's just so many costs to think about when you're building your own machine that most people don't think about. You can actually build the components or purchase the components for, you know, 60% or maybe even half of what you can buy the fully assembled machines for. But I have seen so many clients pour, you know, hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars even into a home built machine after they got all the components on site, because putting together a machine that actually works and just works and that you know is going to work and it's going to work day after day after day, which is what you really need for production, is a lot harder than a lot of people think. In fact, in my website, I have a whole section called Build Your Own Freeze Dryer. And the first paragraph says, it's hard because building your own freeze dryer is hard. Designing it, not as hard. I mean, there's a lot of engineering you need to know, but building it, that's hard.
Where do we know that something is bad with a freeze dryer? Like, is there different components or factors that, from your experience, you'd say good freeze dryer has these, bad freeze dryer has this?
I have seen freeze dryers that were built and sold without any refrigeration system at all. Never, ever buy a freeze dryer that has no refrigeration system. I'm going to just give you a quick background reason why. So once you pump out the air and non-condensable gases out of the process chamber, whether that's a small, tiny unit at home or a big, huge commercial unit, the only source of pressure in your chamber from that time on is the water that's actually creating gases, right? Water vapor is a gas. It creates gas at a certain rate, and your system can remove that gas at a certain rate, and that equilibrium that's established is the pressure that you read in your chamber. Your vacuum pump can pump out, let's call it a, relatively speaking, a very small amount of fluid per minute per unit time. Your refrigeration system, on the other hand, when it's cold enough, it acts as a cryogenic pump, a cryogenic vacuum pump. because it's removing the moisture from the chamber and it's plating it out as ice on the surfaces, the cold surfaces. And that is, by definition, a form of vacuum pump because you're creating vacuum in its wake.
Okay.
It turns out that if you look at the performance of cryogenic pumps versus mechanical vacuum pumps, which are what we pump our chambers out with, just a single square meter of cold surface area can pump up to 250,000 cubic meters per hour of water vapor, which is in the range of, let's call it 200,000 CFM. So if you compare that against a vacuum pump, like for example, maybe one that you get on a harvest right, which is what most people know, or maybe one that you get on a commercial freeze dryer, the harvest right is in the range of 10 cubic meters per hour. So you have 250,000 cubic meters per hour versus 10. Or for a large commercial system, you have 2,000, but still 250,000 versus 2,000. It's not even in the same universe of pumping speed. So once you start generating this vapor in your chamber, you need that speed to keep the pressure down. And if you don't keep the pressure down, then the sublimation temperatures go higher. So this gets into the realm of vapor physics, which I spent a lot of time thinking about and learning. And we can do a whole subject on the vapor physics.
Oh, I'm sure. Why does a larger pump matter, or does it really matter at all?
Right. This is actually a really good question, and it's one that's not so obvious. And I get these questions even from major OEMs. The fact is that once you have pumped out that non-condensable gas, your vacuum pump is almost a non-player in the performance of the machine over the course of the drying cycle. It pumps a little bit, but it can do maybe 1 kilogram per hour for a really big, huge vacuum pump, like a 2,000 cubic meter per hour vacuum pump, which is 1,200 CFM. That's 1 kilogram per hour. In a small home freeze dryer, that might be somewhat significant. That's 2.5 pounds per hour. So over the course of a 24-hour period, sure, you could get 50 pounds of water removed but that's by a really big pumping set. But if you look at a commercial freeze dryer that's doing 1,000 kilograms or 1,500 kilograms, that 24 kilograms in a 1 day cycle it's almost not even worth considering. It's less than 1%. So once the vacuum pump gets your chamber down to pressure, it really doesn't play much of a factor, except for one thing. It needs to be able to establish a pressure that's low enough for you to have sublimation happening at the right temperature. The pressure in your chamber drives the temperature at which sublimation takes place. That's the only thing that pressure does, is it changes the temperature that you boil at. Right. So let's say you boil water in Denver or on the top of Mount Everest, as opposed to at sea level. The water boils at a lower temperature. I think most people kind of have a grasp on this. Well, you can keep going lower and lower and lower in pressure as if you're going into outer space, getting higher in elevation, until you're boiling water at freezing point. Right. This is what's called the triple point, where you have the pressure is so low that your temperature at boiling is 0 degrees C, which is 32 degrees Fahrenheit. That's why once you get below that pressure, the temperature will also drop. Now all of the vaporization that you have taking place from the product that's in your chamber, all the moisture that's coming out as vapor, all that vaporization is taking place at sub-zero temperatures. So you don't have any hot steam in your chamber. It's all cold steam. It's all bitterly cold steam, if you will. And it exhausts all that cold vapor onto your plates, onto your chamber walls or your heaters. That cools those heaters, and then your heating system will add more power to those shells to bring them back up to temperature, because they have a certain temperature target they have to meet. So your chamber will automatically compensate for that, and then as the cycle goes through, you get less and less vaporization. Because there's lots of reasons why you get less vaporization over time. We can have a whole subject about that. But you get less and less vaporization, so your pressure will go down in your chamber. You kind of get this curve. It's a decay curve where you get out onto this flat part of the curve at the end where you're almost dry but not quite dry, and it takes a little bit longer to get through that final cycle. That's because it's really hard for you to get heat into the core of your product where the actual sublimation is taking place, because you created this insulation layer in your product. So at first, your product is all ice, and so the heat that hits that ice, the ice can absorb it right away, and some of it will come off as vapor. As you dry that product, your ice core gets smaller and smaller. This is the surface of your product, and the ice core gets smaller and smaller. Now you have however many millimeters of insulation for that heat to have to travel through to get to that ice core before it can actually cause vaporization. The fact is that in any system, in any place in the universe, you need to add heat in order to vaporize. It's physics. It's the laws of physics. You can't get around it. I've heard people say you don't need to add heat to a freeze dryer in order to freeze dry. You do, because you won't have any sublimation happen. You'll have some happen at first because there'll be some residual heat, maybe a tiny bit of heat that absorbs, in through the atmosphere or ambient, but it'll just stop, right? You'll get your chamber down to vacuum and everything will get really cold and it'll just stop unless you add heat. So yes, you have to add heat to a freeze dryer in order to make it work. So again, you asked about things to stay away from in freeze dryers. Stay away from freeze dryers that don't add an appropriate amount of heat. I really don't know that there are any that are like that. There are some people who, have laboratory ones that they talk about that they don't have to heat. But
fortunately for me, my last name is Layman. So in layman's terms, I want to know how is it possible that you see ice on your chamber wall, but yet it's 130 degrees, drying that? Like, how is that possible that this, like an actual machine can do that?
Keep in mind that your chamber's at vacuum, which is a pretty good insulator, right? It's very difficult to transfer heat across a vacuum. There are supposedly 3 methods of transferring heat, right? One is conduction, one is convection, and one is radiation. So in a vacuum, there is no convection, because convection heat transfers where some gas, you have fluid flow that maybe it's air that brushes across one surface and it absorbs a bunch of heat, and then it, like in a heater, and then it blows on your skin and you can feel that heat. So the air is actually transferring that heat from one place to another. That's called convection heat transfer. That can't happen in a vacuum because there's no air to do any convection with. There's no fluid whatsoever. That leaves you with conduction and radiation. So the heat is conducted up through the shelf into your product, or it's radiated down on the product from the shelf above. Both things happen in your chamber, but you can't get any heat transfer from your shelves, which are on the inside, to the condenser, which is on the outside, or it might be vapor plates or coils or something located in a different location. So that's why you can have both hot and cold in your chamber, and it's necessary. Your cycle would stop. It would go nowhere if you didn't have both, because you have to remove as much heat as you put in. Otherwise, you'll cook all your product.
It's a myth that you're freeze drying candy, but it's a great term that's being used because it's kind of creating a new product. But what is really happening with candy that people put in a freeze dryer?
Mostly what you're doing is expanding it. So just like you would do with a marshmallow, but there is actually a little bit of drying that happens. Raise the temperature of the candy to a certain degree where the sugars start to relax, they get soft. When you draw vacuum, there's some air pockets. There's a great deal of gas pockets that are inside the candy material. And when you draw vacuum, those expand and it causes it to sort of blow up like a mushroom, not a mushroom like a marshmallow. Once it's actually expanded, though, you do need to actually remove some moisture to recrystallize those sugars so that when you cool it down, they actually they stay that nice crisp, crunchy texture. If you don't dry it long enough, many people that have done this will know that it's just a little too chewy, right? You don't get the quality that you want. You don't get that nice snap, that crunch, but you're only really reducing the moisture content in candy by maybe 3%. I did have some clients measure it for me, right? What does it weigh going in and what does it weigh coming out? And it was about 3% lighter. So the good news is that you're getting almost all of your weight that you put in back out as dried product. And since you're selling it by weight, this is a really good thing. when you're doing food, like say strawberries, you're actually reducing the weight by a factor of 4 or 5. So you put in 100 pounds of strawberries, you get 20, 25 pounds out. That's, something that you have to keep in mind. So, but really what you need for doing candy is a vacuum oven. It just turns out that a freeze dryer is an exceptional vacuum oven. And the reason for that is because that vapor condenser, where that moisture, it's not very much, but there's still some moisture that's accumulating on that vapor condenser, that keeps the pumping speed really high. So when you do get the candy to expand, you can draw out that residual moisture that you need, that few percent really fast.
So if I bought a vacuum oven on Amazon, bought it from an American company, whatever,
yep,
what would I see in differences of the product for me doing it in my Harvest Right freeze dryer versus doing it in a vacuum oven? Do you know the difference, or have you seen that?
Sure. You would just take you longer to get the same quality because your vacuum oven is relying completely on the vacuum pumps, which don't pump very much water. So it would tend to run at a little higher pressure, right? So once you start adding that heat and your shelves come up to maybe 130 degrees Fahrenheit or whatever your target temperature is, a lot of that moisture is going to start evolving from your candy all at once, along with some volatile organics like the aromatics that are happening, that are, the flavorings, the aromatics in there, they'll come out. And if you don't have good pumping, then you'll see the pressure start to really rise in your chamber. Now, how much of a problem is that with candy? It might not be as much problem as people think, although I suspect that you will get, if the pressure goes high enough, you'll get less expansion than maybe what you want.
One of the things that I found with freeze drying candy over the past 4 years for me is that I let the chamber cool down from 140 degrees down to like 90 degrees or so. And basically it almost comes out a little bit more cold than super hot. And I've done that because in my early years of doing candy, especially with Skittles, taffy, things like that, I ended up that there would be clumping, and also it would actually still be kind of chewy. But if I let it kind of cool down, it actually would then almost remain crunchy for six to 8 months when I stored it. Why is that? Why did I find that out, or why is that necessary?
It'd be really difficult to measure what's going on with regard to physics, but what's really happening is that you probably, when you vent the system a little too quickly or a little too soon, you might get some collapse, right? So you're actually your material is still really soft, and so as you raise pressure in, now it has vacuum in the core, and you have pressure on the outside, so it might compress your product a little bit. And if you do that before it fully crystallizes, and it doesn't crystallize until it cools, you see. So if you do that before it crystallizes, you would probably see some effects. And you might also have a case where if the air is a little bit higher humidity, you might actually drive some moisture back into your product. But if you get a really good commercial freeze dryer to do the drying of candy, and I know some, so if anyone wants to know, just reach out to me on my website. You can get a fully done batch of Skittles, say, still taking them out at fairly warm temperatures, and that's because you get it pretty dry pretty fast. So it's really about what pressure do you maintain in your chamber at what temperatures. That's so key for anything that you run in a freeze dryer, maintaining your pressure in a good range.
Everyone's questioning, why does certain candy pop and other ones don't? What's the makeup of a certain candy that we're seeing pop and other ones not? So
some of them you can get them to expand, but then they'll just collapse right back down to a shriveled thing, right? Like Swedish fish, for example. So many people have tried to freeze dry Swedish fish and they find out that they can't. So what is the thing that causes that? So in that case, it's invert sugar. So invert sugar is just a certain variant of sugar. You can make this out of regular table sugar. It's just a certain crystalline form, if you will, of sugar that is not prone to recrystallization. So invert sugar is just where you heat it up and you super saturate it, meaning that it's more sugar than the water can actually contain, and then you cool it down a certain way, and it remains syrupy instead of recrystallizing out as like table sugar.
Mm-hmm.
That is invert sugar, and there's a lot of real good applications for that. For example, you want that in ice cream because you don't want the sugar to recrystallize in ice cream. You want it in certain candies and that sort of thing, but it's not going to freeze dry, because when you try to draw out that moisture to get it to recrystallize, well, the whole point of invert sugar is that it doesn't crystallize. So the whole thing is just going to collapse. It won't lock it into that shape. Anything with a lot of fat is going to be difficult to freeze dry. So chocolates are a prime example of that. It's very difficult to freeze dry chocolate unless you formulate it with something. Right? So chocolate ice cream, for example, you can freeze dry. Although chocolate ice cream requires a little bit different parameters than vanilla ice cream, believe it or not. And the differences are the sugar content and the fat content. So a really premium type of ice cream like Haagen-Dazs or Ben and Jerry's or something like that, you might actually have more difficulty freeze drying because it has much higher milk fat content. But yeah, so those are two of the ones that I know the best. Liver is actually fairly tricky to freeze dry because it's very high in dissolved salts and sugars and fatty acids and stuff like that. The liver is, it's blood, right?
Yeah.
So if the liver is of lower moisture content, you're going to have trouble freeze drying it. It's going to want to form this crust on the outside that looks like it's burnt. It's not really burnt. It's just discolored, because when the blood starts to recongeal as liquid before it gets fully dry, it forms this darker crust and it looks like it's burnt. It's not, but it's not really good freeze dried product either. You have to be pretty careful. You have to be pretty gentle with liver in order to do that. So, and there's some other products that are tricky too.
Since your background is in freeze drying and vacuums and things like that, what did you think when you saw Harvest Right come out with this machine that was all for a home? What was your first impressions? What have you thought of that company in terms of kind of getting everybody a chance to have a freeze dryer in their home?
Bloody brilliant. Now it's an expensive piece of kit for a home, right? And yet they've sold hundreds of thousands of them. The fact is that they brought a very capital intensive process to such a affordable level that, just a family can buy one and have it at home. That's a big, big deal. Harvest Right was far and away, and maybe not indisputably, the first and the best to start doing this, right? They've been doing it for a long time. There has actually been quite an explosion in freeze-dried applications, products, and things that are available on the market, like candy, but like pet treats and like mushrooms and a whole bunch of stuff, right? The supplements and stuff that you can take. These things have all really been enabled by Harvest Right. Because when you get a really tiny unit like this with a really small cost, and for a company, $4,000 is pocket change. It's ridiculously low barrier to entry, but you can do real proof of concept in a Harvest Right. You don't need big production. You just need to know, is this going to give me the product that I want? And there are so many companies who have gone commercial that started with Harvest Rights. In fact, I'd say that more than 50% of all the customers that have had approach me have said, I have 10 Harvest Rights. I have 20 Harvest Rights. I've got one customer who had 35 Harvest Rights, and they were running them in a room. And I just really need to get my production up, can help me with that. And the answer is, of course. So then the next question is, well, why would you just, you got 35 Harvest Rights that cost, I don't know, let's call it $3,000 a piece. That's, $100,000. Why wouldn't you just spend $100,000 and get 35 Harvest Rights to get commercial grade production? And there are so many reasons. There's so many reasons. I mean, now you got 35 vacuum pumps, you have 35 power feeds, you have 35 vacuum chambers. You need to load 35 chambers. You need to unload 35 chambers. You got all these little teeny tiny trays. If you want to do real commercial production, it's just not tenable, right? You start to get a different set of metrics that you pay attention to when you go into commercial production, and that is production speed. Production speed is everything in any kind of commercial production, whether you're making nails or iPhones or packages of freeze-dried food for a hiker. It's the amount of product that you can get through your factory per unit time is so much more important than every other factor. It dwarfs the cost of power. It dwarfs the cost of the facility. It dwarfs your labor costs. It dwarfs every other single thing, because that's your revenue. Your revenue, the more production you have, the more revenue you have.
Is there factors that you've actually consulted with other companies where there's this break-even point that you do need to consider a commercial because it will reap you a return much more quicker than all the other factors that you have right now?
If you can see that you have a great deal of opportunity and that you are missing out on opportunity because you can't produce enough fast enough, then you need to start thinking about commercial freeze dryers immediately. Now, it takes a while to order and get delivered a commercial freeze dryer. It's not like a Harvest Right there or a Blue Alpine. They're not in stock, right? It takes 3 to 6 months to get a commercial freeze dryer, depending on what size it is, or more if you're ordering it from overseas. So you have to plan ahead. As far as when does it become untenable to when is it absolutely necessary to move from a whole room full of small freeze dryers to a single larger one? This is just maybe a rule of thumb, but in my opinion, if you're getting beyond 1,000 pounds a day, you really need to start thinking commercial freeze dryer. I think that might even be too much, but there's plenty of people who have 20 harvest rates that can get close to 1,000 pounds a day of production. But if you need to get more than 1,000 pounds a day, you really should be looking at a bigger freeze dryer. So I did have this pet food freeze dryer call me up, and he said, "Hey, I saw your machines at the Process Expo right in Chicago. We're there every year. I've worked with TechSource Systems, so I work with them. I provide them engineering and sales and marketing services." So we were there, and he saw a machine, and he said, "Well, I can get one of these new harvest rate machines that have the capability of putting 9 big full-size baking trays in at a time. And it only costs me whatever, $30,000. Why would I buy $1 million machine when I can buy, 30 of these harvest rates?" And the answer is, well, you don't need 30 harvest rates to make up the capacity of one of these big $1 million machines. You need 52 of them. And I laid out in CAD how much footprint in a factory he would have to reserve to operate and maintain 52 harvest rates, the big 9 tray machines we're talking about. It's not the XL, it's the whatever their next model is above the XL.
HRC 100 that they, yeah.
The HRC 100, yeah. It would have taken him 2.5 or 3 times more factory space to get 52 of these HRC machines in, but the footprint of the single machine was much smaller. But here's the other factor. When you're in commercial production, the thing that is a killer, an absolute killer to your business, is when the machine goes down. It's not operating properly. So you need to have a machine that is built to operate day in and day out, day after day after day, for 360 or however many days a year you want to operate that machine. It's going to be there. It's going to produce, because you're going to get clients. Everyone that I've helped get a machine, a smaller machine, by the time they get the smaller machine installed, they've already got contracts from clients that they say, "Oh, I need to order the next bigger machine." And then they get the next bigger machine, and a month later they're saying, "I need to get the next bigger machine," because when customers find out that you have freeze drying capacity, real freeze drying capacity, they start coming to you with contracts. They're like, hey, I've got a contract for you to do 100,000 pounds of mushrooms a month. You know, can you do it? And the answer is yes, but not yet.
Why are there so many people looking for people who have these like larger freeze dryers? Like, is there that much demand for it? Why don't those companies just invest in the equipment themselves? Or is it just like they're waiting for a machine to be developed, and so they have this lag time? Is that what it is?
No, almost all of them are just using the product for something else, right? So, for example, the mushrooms, right? Somebody wants to use the mushrooms as a base ingredient for some other process. And they have been getting their mushrooms, their freeze-dried mushrooms from China. Oh, let me just back up and say that if you freeze dry any food product, it is, I don't know, 10 times easier to turn it into powder than in any other method. Because it just, you've had freeze-dried stuff, it just crumbles into powder almost by itself. But if you crush it, it becomes powder. Well, this is exactly what you need for, you know, supplements and ingredients for other sorts of things like cosmetics or whatever. I just had a gentleman call me. He wants to buy a big freeze dryer for aloe vera powder, right? Because there's no better way to powder aloe vera than to freeze dry it. The fact is that, yes, the demand is so much larger than the supply that the freeze dryers just can't keep up. I was out in Oregon 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago. This company has, I don't know, 13 large freeze dryers, you know, the 2,500 pound capacity freeze dryers per day. And they can't add enough capacity fast enough. They've got customers, if they could double their capacity overnight, they would make twice as much money, but they can't because it takes longer than that to get freeze dryers. You know, they have these giant facilities that are unimaginable, like 2 football fields under one roof, and they don't have enough freeze drying capacity. So yeah, the fact is, everyone that I know who has capacity, the capacity gets used up almost immediately.
I think if you want to look at a commercial freeze dryer, have your set menu of really what you want to go after in your business too, because if you're going to go commercial, you can't just have 25 different flavors of candy. You can't do what I'm doing right now, which is have ice cream, 4 different flavors of freeze-dried ice cream, have 4 different types of fruits, have 6 different types of candies. I've got to choose my path. I can experiment with my smaller freeze dryers, but if you're looking at commercial, like you've found a recipe or you've found a niche, or you're going to go after a particular customer segment, and that's where it makes a lot more sense.
Most people, when they're starting out a small business, they think of the cost of machinery and they say, oh, I can't afford that bigger machine because instead of $3,000, it's $130,000, right? That's like a next step. But the fact is that businesses don't pay for production machines. You don't pay for that freeze dryer. Your freeze dryer pays for the freeze dryer, and it pays for all the overheads. It pays for the labor. It pays for everything, right? Your machine pays for itself plus and gives you some profit at the end of the day. And if it doesn't, then it doesn't make sense to move forward yet. But if you can look at what your business level is, and it can justify the payments, the monthly payments, if you finance over 5 years or whatever on that freeze dryer, and have enough for all those extra things that I talked about, the overheads, that's when you should really start looking at a commercial freeze dryer. Because it's just like when you buy your first home, you're like squeezing your butt cheeks together because you're like, I don't know if I can afford this. What happens if I lose my job, right? You know, I'm gonna go bankrupt. And the fact is that you are always going to face that issue, right? The fear, the uncertainty of the market. But the fact is, if you don't take that risk at some point, you will probably never end up being more than somebody who is racing around, spending all of your hours chasing chickens in your yard, you know, trying to fight fires. You literally can never progress beyond that. So the very first time you see where the level of business that you could get, somebody comes to you with a contract that you can't fulfill, seriously consider looking at a commercial freeze dryer, and everyone who does it well that I know has never regretted buying a freeze dryer.
Yeah, and also I'd add that people can be a co-packer for somebody else while you're building up your orders.
In
So
fact,
if
a lot of people do that. A lot of commercial freeze dryers do that. Absolutely.
And you just said it, like there's the demand right now, and there will be for years to come. Yes. Because if you are the person that has a shorter distance for that company to not have to ship or do deliveries, they can come pick up the finished product. If you don't have all the customers to support running that machine as much as you need to pay off at your machine, then part of your business plan should be to rent it out and make up that money. And I'm guaranteed there's a bunch of people that are looking to rent it out. And so that's a good way to do that.
Yeah.
In your experience, how would you estimate or give someone advice on the footprint they would need for, getting started into commercial freeze dryer?
The footprint that you need to pay most attention to is not the square feet. It's the how many amps of power does your facility have available? Because that's always the limiting factor. Freeze dryers are power hungry machines. You have to heat the shelves. You have to run a chiller or refrigeration system to pull out all that heat. You have vacuum pumps to run. It's power intensive. There's some machines that you can provide heat with natural gas, but for anyone who's starting out, just still starting out, you're probably not going to buy one of those machines because they are a lot more expensive than the ones that are electric heat. And there's all different issues. We can talk. I could talk for days and days about the trade-offs between gas and electric heat, because there's advantages on both sides. No, the footprint that is the biggest deal to think about is power. Do you have the power to operate not just the machine that you're planning to buy, but at least the next machine, right? Because like I said, everyone ends up ordering the second machine months after they get delivery of the first one. And however many machines you think you might need. The second thing to really consider is that you have to freeze your material before you put it into your freeze dryer. You can get a freeze dryer that actually will get cold. The shelves will get cold. And so you can freeze the product inside your freeze dryer. But unless you're doing ice cream, it's a total gimmick, right? Because it's a $1 million freezer that you could use the same, you could use that space that you're putting all that material in your freeze dryer and spending hours to get it frozen. You can use that space as a standard walk-in freezer that's going to cost you, in a commercial sense, maybe $100,000 or $200,000, whereas this machine's $1 million machine. You don't use a $1 million machine to do a $200,000 process. It doesn't make any sense. So you need to look at it and say, hey, where am I going to put my freezer so that I can pre-freeze my product? And you need to do it in a way that you can actually get it from the freezer to your machine in an effective manner. And almost every commercial freeze dryer has a strategy to do that, to get the product from the freezer to the machine. So you just have to reach out to OEMs. I mean, I highly recommend that you contact every single OEM that you can think of. So, and here's a quick list. You have GEA out of Europe. You have Cudden, which is there in New Zealand. You have Parker Freeze Dry in the United States, great company, they make good equipment. You have TechSource Systems, they're in Utah, they're all American made, an even better freeze dryer. You have Wave, which is a sort of kind of middle, they're a little bit larger than, say, a Harvest Right, but they're not nearly big enough to be a commercial machine. But I think they're working on it. And then there's a couple of other players. There's some companies to stay away from too. And if you want to know who those are, just reach out to me at SunTorr.com. I can help you with that, but I'm not going to say it on your program here. Contact every single OEM. The place that you're going to learn about the machinery that you're planning to buy, and I don't care if it's any production machinery, you find out from the OEM because they know more about their machinery than anyone else. People have this jaundiced opinion of salesmen. That's used car salesmen, right? Car salesmen give you a bad impression of what salesmen are, but a really good salesman for a production machinery company or any kind of business to business project, what they do is they teach you. They teach you all the things that you need to know. They're just giving you information so you can make the best decision. And if you have a salesperson for an OEM that's not doing that, find another one. Go to a different OEM, because you will find. So learn everything that you can about all things like their strategy. Like, how do you get product from the freezer? What does it take to load this? How big are the shelves? How heavy are the shelves? Are they easy to handle or are they hard to handle? How do I get my dry product out of the machine? What's the refrigeration capacity? Oh, this is so important, because if you don't have the right refrigeration capacity, you're going to be running a slow machine and you're going to have poorer quality product. You got to have the capacity to get that heat out. Because remember, your ice banks are your vacuum pumps. And if you don't put enough chilling capacity on them, they won't operate fast enough to keep your chamber pressure down. And then you have to go slower. You have to put less product in. So what kind of vacuum pump do I have? Do I have an oil-filled vacuum pump? Water and oil don't mix so well when it comes to a vacuum pump, because they're, in short, when you get water into your oil and it starts condensing in there and the oil starts to turn a little milky colored or whatever, the pump runs warm. So that water that condenses in there is going to reflash to vapor on every compression cycle. And it's going to do it on the vacuum side of that. So you're not going to get as deep a vacuum as you want. Sometimes you can't even get deep enough to start your process. And it also hurts the pumping speed. So, and if there's oil in there, you got to constantly be changing the oil. For little tiny machines like at home, oil-filled pump is fine. Rotary vane pump that works fine. But for a commercial machine, if you have an oil-filled rotary vane vacuum pump, you're asking for trouble down the line.
In your experience, do the sales reps for these OEMs have experience being able to consult about your recipe, if you have one, or kind of brainstorming, like, I got this idea for this? Or if you're going to approach an OEM for a commercial freeze dryer, you should already have that kind of ready for them.
Any good salesperson for any machinery ought to know the application that they're selling their machinery into. So they should be able to help you with things like, what's at least a good starter recipe for this product? What are the gotchas? Is it, if I bought a machine to run this product, like for example, freeze drying coffee, tricky, very tricky, trickier than you would think. Is it going to work? And the answer should be yes, but under the certain circumstances. If you're talking to a salesman and he doesn't know that, see if you can get a hold of somebody else from that company, or maybe an applications engineer from that company, or go find a different OEM who know what they're talking about. So, because I run into these questions all the time. I mean, for me, that's part of what I do, is I help people develop recipes. I do it all the time. So, is
there advice that you would give for people who do want to start an entrepreneurial journey with recipes? Is there a good product to start out with that you won't get overcomplicated and overstressed about, like having to really fine tune a recipe and recreate the wheel? Like what products would you suggest people start out freeze drying that don't overcomplicate the process?
Start out with ones that don't have big liability. That's a major thing to consider. A client that I spent a fair bit of time with operate out of Houston, and they do breast milk, and they are a great company, right? They were on Shark Tank. So if you don't know who I'm talking about, just watch some old episodes of Shark Tank about freeze drying breast milk and you'll find them. They found out that because, they're actually freeze drying breast milk from a particular mother, and they need to get that particular breast milk back to that particular mother. If they have some kind of shutdown in the middle of their process and the milk spoils, they just lost however much breast milk that is not really so replaceable.
Right.
And not only that, but you don't have a customer for that whole freeze dryer full of breast milk. You have 100, or you have 250 customers that have your product inside that. So you have this huge liability. It's a great business, and these guys are doing great. They're really doing great work, but it's trickier than doing Skittles, right? Because what's the liability of Skittles? Well, if you ruin a batch, you buy some more Skittles, you put it in, and you get ones that are good. Something to consider. You brought this up in the beginning in the intro. The difference between USDA and FDA inspected product. this is actually something to consider when you're thinking, what product do I want to freeze dry? Any protein that is for human consumption, be it eggs or meat or something like that, is going to be subject to USDA inspection. Why does that matter? Well, the USDA actually has to have a person on site at your facility when you load your freeze dryer and when you unload your freeze dryer every single day for every load. Now, they have plenty of people, and they'll have, you can even make them a little office. And if you have a good freeze dryer that they know is clean, they can see your process, they understand how well you can sanitize your dryer and that sort of thing. And by the way, brand matters when it comes to that sort of thing. Then it's pretty easy. It's almost like a formality sign off. They just come to make sure that you haven't changed something or you're not skipping steps or whatever. You have to rely on that USDA inspector to be there in order to run product. And so if he's sick that day and they can't get somebody there, you might be down for that day, and that's a risk. FDA is for, basically any product for any of the other products for consumption, whether it's pet food for pets or non-protein products for human consumption. The FDA has just a once yearly inspection where they come in and they take a look at your site, your factory, your machinery, your processes and stuff. And if it's good enough, they'll sign it off. If it's not good enough, for example, let's say you want to freeze dry raw pet food. And this is a big, huge thing, right? That the raw pet food market has caused more freeze dryer sales in the last 10 years than anything else, I think. Well, the FDA is not such a fan of raw pet food because it's full of bacteria, right? Freeze drying is not a kill step. It'll get you maybe a 2 log or 3 log reduction in bacteria, but by log, I mean factor of 10. So a 2 log means a 100 times reduction. So you go from 100% to 99%. So a 3 log would be 0.1%. But in order to meet the FDA requirements for kill step, you need to have 5 log reduction. So you need to have a 500,000 times reduction in bacteria count. And that sounds like it's enormous, but in bacteria count is not so much enormous. It doesn't take a lot of bacteria to spoil your food. So because freeze drying is not a kill step, you might have to jump through some extra hoops in order to achieve that for the FDA if they decide they want it. Now, pet food is not required to have kill steps at this point, but that doesn't mean that the FDA likes it. So you might still end up, and even for certain customers, you're probably going to end up finding some way to do a kill step. And the kill steps for freeze-dried pet food is pretty expensive, capital-intensive equipment.
Am I right to say that definition, though, the difference in FDA and USDA is FDA is dealing with people with selling product versus the USDA is how you handle the product. So if you're, let's say, going to process food for someone else to then sell it, you would just have the USDA observe your food facility, but you're not technically, do you have to still go through the FDA side of things?
Well, if you're not going to sell your product, you don't need either. Right. You're not subject to either if you're not selling your product in the open market. So if you're just making it for yourself, neither apply. But if you're in business, you're going to be selling your product to the other. And the FDA will inspect your facilities to make sure that you are creating sanitary product. And the USDA will do it on a daily basis, essentially. The real difference is proteins for human consumption. That's really the difference and the level of inspection. And the FDA only inspects once a year.
It does seem a little intimidating to have to not only go with a commercial freeze dryer that you have this investment in, which we've already talked about can pay back huge dividends, but it's like, oh man, I got to deal with the federal side of these things. And if you're somebody new to it, how do you even approach that? Is it best to go get consulting so that someone's like, hey, this is who you need to talk to, that type of thing? Is it intimidating or does it not?
Oh, this is a great question. So actually, this is true with a lot of government agencies. If you reach out to them and say, hey, how do I do this right so that I can pass your inspections? They will bend over backwards to help you figure out how to do it right. Whether it's the patent office, right? The patent attorney or inspector, he he'll tell you everything you need to do, right? If it's the FDA, they'll come in and they'll say, oh, here, you see this, you see that, you need to fix these sorts of things, right? If it's an electrical inspector for your house, they'll do the same thing. So yeah, reach out to those inspectors and they'll help you. Consultants can help you to make decisions ahead of time, or at least give you the information. But the horse's mouth, which is the actual inspectors themselves, that's really the right place to go for that kind of info. And you can find it online too.
Yeah, that's what I did for my local health district rep. Is I talked to them about everything, and they definitely like me over other people that try to, maneuver and take side steps. It's like, it's just best to abide by it and do that. I always like asking my guests what they see the freeze-dried industry becoming. What's the future forecast that you see that gives all of us much more empowerment and passion and drive to go and continue pursuing that entrepreneurial side of things in freeze drying?
I think that the market essentially is kind of unlimited. There's certain applications that tend to be better freeze dried, but the fact is you get a higher quality product and something that has better nutrition profile out of a freeze dryer than you do any other way. Whether it's powdered product, because you can do spray drying, but it's all done at high pressure and high temperature, right? So the fact is that, I don't know, like every week or every 2 weeks, somebody comes to me with a new freeze drying application that I've never heard of. And there's big opportunity. Here's why there's so much demand and there's so much potential out there. Because people don't think about this issue when they're a small business. There are 300 million people in the United States. There's another, I don't know, 100 million or whatever in Canada and another 50 million in Mexico. And that's just North America. A lot of these products are global now. When you have that many people, it creates overwhelmingly large demand. It's like people say, well, the candy business it's got to be run its course by now. The fact is that Mars Corporation couldn't even make Skittles fast enough to supply the freeze dryers, all the mom and pop freeze dryers to make freeze dried Skittles. They literally ran out of Skittles. That's how big this market is. And that's just the beginning, right? So there's so many people. And if you make a compelling product, anytime you bring value to people, as long as you get it in front of them, they're going to want it. It's not everyone, but enough people will want it that you're not going to be lacking for opportunity out there to sell your stuff. But I'll say this, the higher the quality going into your freeze dryer, the higher the quality coming out, right? If you want something that knocks people's socks off because it tastes so good, put stuff into the freeze dryer that already tastes really good, and it'll concentrate those flavors, right? So if you're going to freeze dry apples, don't be going and buying Red Delicious, right? Go buy Honey Crisp or Cosmic Crisp or something like that. Something that when you bite that apple, you're like, oh, that's a good apple, right? Or a great peach. Or if you want to do proteins, do something that, knocks your socks off, like really tasty steak or shrimp or lobster or crab or something. And there's so many people that want high quality product that they can just reconstitute really quickly, right? Think about all the chefs in the world that need to have, really good shrimp to put on top of their scampi, at their Italian restaurant. Right now they have to have it frozen, and then they have to take it out of the freezer, and they have to thaw it out, and then they have to, cook it up and all that sort of stuff. It would be so much better if they took freeze-dried shrimp out of a package, put it in a little cup, and poured in some hot water, and 30 seconds later, they've got shrimp that you can't tell wasn't just cooked 30 seconds ago.
Yeah.
Think about that. The market is completely untapped. Your imagination is your best tool. And just think to yourself, what could I make that knocks my socks off? And try some. Take it to the market. Use your Harvest Right or your Blue Alpine or your Stay Fresh or your Cube or whatever you got to make some as proof of concept, and approach some customers with it, some people you think are customers, or go to the farmer's market, hand them out for free, and figure out what people just really react to, right? And you'll find your market.
What's the most interesting application?
Well, the most bizarre one to me, I guess it's maybe not bizarre in Asia, but it's freeze-dried antlers. Yeah, deer antlers, like elk antlers and reindeer antlers and stuff. Because remember, when you freeze dry it, it's easier to powder. right? So it's some kind of Chinese medicine or whatever. And well, how much of that can you sell? There's like 2 billion people in Asia that want this kind of stuff, right? So it's huge. In fact, the people who do freeze dried antlers usually can't make enough of it because they take up a lot of room, right? You gotta use quite a bit of space for antlers. I don't know. Another one is freeze dried pets, right? Your pet dies and you don't want to take it to a taxidermist, so you take it to a freeze dryer and they can freeze dry it. They make it stand in whatever position, and when it comes out, it looks just like your pet because it is your pet.
Do you have to keep it in a dehumidified like glass case or anything, or?
Probably. Probably. I don't know. I've never asked
Yeah.
anyone who's actually freeze dried a pet. Probably. Yeah, because if it starts to absorb moisture from the atmosphere, yeah, it could start to smell.
Where can someone reach out to you? I'm going to include the contact information as a part of this episode, but why would someone reach out to you? What services do you provide, and how do they get in touch with you?
So you can get a hold of me at SunTorr.com. I have a contact us page, and you can look at all different types of equipment. You'd want to contact me because I just answer questions for people on the phone all the time. I don't charge for questions and answers over the phone. So call me if you have a question about anything freeze drying. Just give me a call. I'll answer your question for you. Whether it's, hey, I'm trying to do some new product. What do you think how do you think I should program it, or what should I watch out for? Just give me a call or reach out to me on email. You'll find my phone number on my website as well. My phone number and my email are both there, so you can contact me easily. I have a huge, deep knowledge of not just freeze drying and the industry and the equipment, but also the physics that underlies it. I probably know as much as anyone in North America about this particular topic. So feel free to reach out. Yeah, I don't, if if you're working with a company and you need me to come and fix your processes or whatever, or help you run better, then we'll do a consulting deal. But or if you need freeze drying equipment, I've got some of that too.
Well, I've definitely enjoyed our conversation, so I appreciate you giving us all this information because there's a lot of things that are said out there in the internet and the social webs, and it's nice to talk to someone who actually has experience and knowledge and it still is actually active in it today. So thanks for your time being on this podcast and talking with me, and we'll be having more conversations for sure.
That was my pleasure. Yeah, I hope we do this again.
Awesome.